very much to Dr. Jess Williamson for being here with us today. We're going to be hearing from her on round bale silage management, which I think is a very timely and appropriate topic for a lot of people who are interested in shifting their forage production that way. So thank you, Dr. Williamson, for being here today, and I will go ahead and turn it over to you.
Thanks. Thanks so much, Dr. Grev, for having me this morning. I wanted to flip on my camera so that everyone can see me and say good morning, but I am going to turn it off for bandwidth issues. We have rural internet. I live in South Central Pennsylvania, and cameras have been known to cause freezing in my household. So good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning. So as Amanda said, I'm livestock and forage manager with AGCO. I live just north of Altoona, Pennsylvania. So my home base is Heston, Kansas, where we make the large square baler, where we make the small square baler. We have a new round baler coming out soon out of our Heston, Kansas plant, and also the windrower, which is what you're seeing here. The primary brand that I work with is Massey Ferguson. I also work with Fendt, which is based out of Western Europe. So my position is global. So I have been with AGCO for about 2 years now. Previously, I was the extension specialist at Penn State University for about 5 years. Decided to leave that position so that I could have a work from home position so that I could be more present with my family while still doing what I love in forages. And I guess the joke is on me because whenever I took the position is whenever the whole world shut down and everybody became work from home. So I just wanted to give you a little bit about my background.
About the state of Maryland, those are the blue dots. Many of the dots you see.
I grew up in Western Maryland on a cow-calf operation in Allegheny County. So I live not too far from where my home place is, and I'm able to still go down there on the weekends and spend that time on my home family farm. So let's get started this morning on some round bale silage management. I have a little bit of data from some other projects that have gone on within the industry from other scientists, but then I'm also excited to share with you a few things that we've been doing at AGCO over the last couple of years. So to start out with, silage bales, or baleage, as it's most commonly referred to, is forage that's higher moisture content than dry hay and then stored and sealed in plastic wrap. These can either be an in-line wrapper situation where you see the long line of tubes with round bales stored within them, or they can be individually wrapped. Either way is very common here in North America, and both ways have very effective ways of mitigating that overall aerobic environment and creating an anaerobic environment. And that's going to be the overall goal whenever we're talking about silage of any kind, is to make sure that we are eliminating the oxygen from that crop, and we want it to create an aerobic environment, which is going to encourage our microbes to convert our sugars into acids. So the difference in silage and dry hay primarily is going to be that moisture level. If we're removing the hay from the field at a higher moisture content, that's going to create the conversion of those microbes, that microbial activity. It's going to create the sugars into acids. I'm going to talk a lot about that in just a minute. But our dry hay, we're typically getting the majority of the respiration stopping in the field. Now, our hay is still going to go through a sweat after we get it baled. And that's going to be what's left of those microbes creating heat. We're going to get some dry matter losses, et cetera. But primarily speaking, if we get our hay down to an ideal moisture content, that bacteria, fungi, and yeast are not going to survive long. But what we want to happen in our silage is for those microbes to have a conducive environment. So we're going to have a higher moisture content. We're going to talk a little bit about some ideal moisture contents in just a minute. So this is taking a look at how this fermentation process happens over time. And so this is typically looking at a corn silage fermentation process. Corn silage compared to our forages that we're going to be talking about today is typically going to have a higher sugar content. What we're going to see is a drop in that pH as that bacteria is converting the sugars into acids. We're going to go from an aerobic phase, which is when oxygen is present, into an anaerobic phase. That's going to be the conversion of aerobic microbes into anaerobic microbes. And those are going to be the guys that are going to be doing all of the heavy lifting and converting those available feedstuffs into acids. Once we get down into the stable phase, in this picture, it's showing right around that 14 to 17 day mark. I typically like to say a minimum of 21 days for our bale silage. We don't want to feed that prior to that 3-week mark. If you can go even longer, even better. We want to make sure that those microbes have had an adequate amount of time to convert those sugars into acids, that fermentation process is stable, and that feed is at the highest quality possible before we're going to go out and feed it. So if we're talking about why bales versus a bunk, we're going to get an overall higher density. Now there's ways that we have our new fancy balers that have variable chamber systems that we can increase the density as high as possible. And I'm going to show some data in just a little bit that shows the higher the density, the better in these silage bales. But if you do happen to have a fixed chamber baler, there are ways that you can either slow down your ground speed, or reduce your overall gear, and maybe bump up that throttle a little bit so that we can get more forage going into that chamber and creating a higher density bale, even with a fixed chamber baler. So it's important that you play around a little bit and get to know your baler as best as possible, because the goal is going to be as high of a density of bale as possible. Also, you are going to get immediate sealing, which is going to give us better fermentation, higher quality feed for our cows, higher milk production, and in turn, it's going to lead to better health of the cows. We're also going to have less risk of spoilage due to less feed being exposed to the air at a time. So we're going to be opening either one bale at a time, or if we're using an inline wrapper, we're going to be pulling one bale or 2 bales or 3 bales out at a time. So we're only going to be having a small face of that bale that's open to the outside oxygen at a time, versus if we're in a silage bunk, we're going to have that entire face of that silage pit open. And as soon as we start exposing that fermented forage to air, we're getting a decline in overall forage quality. This is taking a look at some southern data. So this is taking a look at Bermuda grass, which we don't have a ton of in our area, but it's still worth noting the quality difference in dry hay versus silage hay. So of course they have a significantly different percent moisture here. But if we're taking a look at that relative forage quality difference, this again is extremely significant. We're looking at 100 RFQ versus a 58 RFQ. That opens up the possibility to feed a much, much larger range of livestock versus this Bermuda grass that's baled as dry hay. Dry matter intake is going to be significantly greater for our silage bales. That's going to be another benefit to silage, is the palatability, and the dry matter intake is significantly greater. Crude protein level, once again, is going to be much greater for our silage bales versus dry hay. We'll go down through and we'll talk a little bit about why it is that this is happening. But it's important to note that we're getting almost a 2% greater crude protein content in our silage bales in this lower quality Bermuda grass hay versus our dry hay. And once again, taking a look at our total digestible nutrients, or TDN, here on the bottom row, again, a significant improvement in our overall TDN for silage versus dry hay. So what does this mean? If we are baling forage as baleage versus dry hay, what this means is we can feed a much larger range of livestock. We can meet their dietary needs more closely without the addition of supplementation. So all in all, it's probably going to help our bottom line significantly more, because we then don't need to supplement our livestock. You can see here in the beef cattle example that I have here, I have total digestible nutrient requirements on the left. I have crude protein requirements on the right. And you can see that the Tifton 85 Bermuda grass in its dry hay form is not going to meet the nutritional requirements of our mature bulls or dry cows. But in the baleage form, it does. It does meet the nutritional requirements of these livestock. Whenever we're talking about our cool season perennial forages, typically that 45 to 60% moisture range is going to be the ideal moisture for ideal fermentation, for proper fermentation. Now, with that being said, I don't want you to discount forage that's being baled at 65, 70% moisture or 35 to 40% moisture, because you absolutely can get fermentation if you have a lower moisture or if you have a higher moisture in your bales. It's important that, because we're not at that ideal moisture, that we get that oxygen excluded as quickly as possible. So whether we are wrapping in the field or wrapping at the storage location, it's important that you're working efficiently and effectively, and you're getting those bales wrapped as quickly as possible. We're also going to recommend adding maybe 2 more layers of wrap so that we can ensure that that oxygen is being excluded as quickly as possible. For our 45 to 60% moisture, which is going to be our ideal range, we're going to recommend at least 6 layers of 1 mil polyethylene plastic film. Somewhere between 6 and 8 is going to be ideal for that ideal moisture level.
1, 2.
Sure that our oxygen is being excluded as quickly as possible. So all in all, we're going to have higher yields in our silage bales versus our dry hay. As I stated before, typically there's going to be less refusal rates than dry hay. Now, I do need to make a disclaimer that that statement is up there pending that the fermentation process has occurred ideally, that we're having proper fermentation. There are some bad things that can happen during fermentation, especially once we get up into those higher moisture levels. I'm going to talk about that. I'm going to show some data for a project that I did last year that shows some butyric acid levels. Once we get into that butyric acid and spoilage, now our refusal rates are going to skyrocket. But all in all, if our forage has fermented properly, we're really going to have less refusal rates. And I have seen 100% consumption with some of these high quality silage bales and absolutely no refusal. Livestock just love it. And as we all know, some of our dry hay, depending on the quality and depending on the forage species, can have upwards of 40, 50% refusal rate. Some of our low quality stemmy forages, it's just not palatable for our livestock to eat. Also, for dry hay, it's important to think about this as we're going through and making our hay and trying to get it dried down as quickly as possible. Some research has shown that for every extra day of delay after mowing and before baling, we can get anywhere from a 5 to 6% dry matter yield loss. This, excuse me. This is of course going to depend on weather conditions. But if we think about mowing and then letting our hay lay in the field for 5 days for us to get it dried down to an ideal moisture for dry hay, that could be in the range of 20 to 30% dry matter loss, depending on what those weather conditions are. If we're getting heavy dews and then we're getting bright sunshine, that's going to in turn take away all of those or some of those very valuable carbohydrates, those water soluble carbohydrates. It's just going to result in more yield loss and more quality loss. So if we're harvesting wet forages, we're letting that lay in the field a less amount of time because we want the moisture level to be greater. But also we're incurring less leaf loss as those machines are running through the field. So we're going to get the higher crude protein. We're going to get the higher total digestible nutrients and relative forage quality and relative feed value and all of those things that we're trying to maintain as high as possible in our crop. All of those things are going to remain because the forage that we're harvesting is wetter. So what this is showing down here on the bottom left is a wide swath versus a narrow swath. And so if we're trying to decrease that time to baling silage, we want to decrease that time to baling anything, right? The quicker we can get it off the field, the higher the quality we're going to have and the less dry matter loss we're going to have. This is taking a look at a wide swath versus a narrow swath. And all in all, what this is saying is, as you're going through and mowing, lay that swath out as wide as possible. That's going to increase the drying rate. That's going to decrease the total dry down time. And it's going to help you to get that crop off of the field quicker and more efficiently. I have some cowboy math up here. If we're taking a look at some of the agronomic benefits of silage versus dry hay in terms of economically, if we're taking a look at getting that crop off significantly quicker, and I do have this as alfalfa, premium alfalfa prices. If we're looking at some of our grass hay, we're going to be looking at anywhere around 100 to 120 US dollars per ton. But if we're taking a look at premium quality alfalfa, we can get an increase right around $80 to $88 an acre just by baling premium quality alfalfa at a silage level versus waiting for that to dry down into dry hay. One thing that I wanted to talk about very quickly this morning is a project that we did in Wisconsin this past year. And in our 9900 series windrowers, we have the opportunity to have a double roller conditioner, which we call the Twin Max. I actually forgot to put the little picture on here of the double roller conditioner and how it works within the windrower. If you're interested in that, I can certainly reach out to you and show you some of those diagrams. But essentially, what we saw in Wisconsin in alfalfa was a difference in dry down rate that was pretty significant by using this conditioner in alfalfa. This was a pure stand of alfalfa versus using a single conditioner or no conditioning at all. And what you can see is at this 52-hour mark, we had a forage moisture of about 14% while using the Twin Max double conditioner. We had about a 19 to 20% while using the single conditioner. And at that 52-hour mark, we still had a 35% moisture by not conditioning at all. The farmer's goals at this particular field were to bale this hay as dry hay. He was a dairy farmer, but he did need some forage that was baled dry. And so he gave us this field to work on and to do our project at. And even at the 64-hour mark, we could not get that hay dried. We needed to catch some planes for all of us to go back to our respective homes. So for that no conditioned crop, we ended up baling that as silage for him. So that right there can show you a testament of how conditioners really can affect that overall dry down time. And in a stemmy crop such as alfalfa can really benefit in terms of getting that crop off of the field significantly quicker. So also what I wanted to point out here is, had he wanted this to be baled at the proper silage moisture level, you can see here how much quicker we got down to that 50% moisture range just by conditioning versus not conditioning. So that in and of itself is going to help us to maintain some of those overall nutrient qualities. Another thing to think about, regardless of crop type, regardless of the moisture content at which you're thinking of baling, it's important to take into account the growth stage at harvest. Your forage will never improve its overall quality more than what it's going to be standing in the field. So if you are mowing too late, if you are waiting for that crop to mature much past what its ideal maturity should be based on the livestock that you're feeding, you're already kind of behind. So one of the benefits of baling your forage as silage versus dry hay is maintaining and preserving those available nutrients as much as possible. So if we do get past that stage of maturity, which is going to be ideal, whether it be alfalfa, which I have shown here, or a grass, by improving your overall harvest process and by maintaining that fermentation process, it's going to help us to preserve those overall nutrients as much as possible. This is what's happening in these crops as they continue to increase in their overall stage of maturity. So in these earlier harvested forages, or in the crops here on the left side of this overall growth pattern that you're seeing, we're getting a lot of cell solubles available. This is going to be nutrients that are readily available for digestion within the animal. It's also nutrients that are readily available for fermentation in our fermented forages. As that crop continues to increase in its stage of maturity, that cell wall is going to continue to thicken, and the overall cell solubles are going to be reduced. So what this is going to tell us is the earlier harvested forages, or our forages that are in their earlier stage of growth, are going to give us a better potential for optimal fermentation versus a big stemmy lignified forage that's going to be in a late stage of growth, where there's going to be more cell wall available in that higher NDF, which is going to relate to lower intake, or a higher ADF level, which are all going to be ways that we can indicate how much cell wall contents are in that crop, which ADF is going to be then inversely related to digestibility or energy level. So I did want to make a side note about that the earlier we can harvest those crops, the more cell solubles are going to be available. And fermentation is the conversion of those cell solubles, or those sugars, into acids, into a stable form. So as we continue this conversation of bale silage and some of its advantages versus dry hay, let's take a look at this chart where we can see our storage losses on the left side in the dark gray, and our harvest losses on the right side in the light gray. Along the bottom is going to be the moisture percent at harvest, and along the side is going to be the percent overall dry matter loss. So what we're seeing is a huge swing in increased harvest losses the drier that hay gets. And the wetter that hay is at harvest, the more storage losses we're getting. But if you take a look at that sweet spot right there, where it says haylage, right there in that 45 to 60% range, which is what I said earlier was really our ideal spot for this baled silage, we're going to have the best combination of storage losses and harvest losses. Now, we're still getting storage losses, we're still getting harvest losses, but we're going to have the best combination and the least amount of total losses if we can really get in that 45 to 60% moisture range at harvest. We're not getting as much sweat. We're not getting as much of a increase in heating due to the microbial activity. And we're also during storage, and we're also not getting all of that leaf loss and the dry matter loss during the harvest process as what we get in our field cured and really dry hay. So next, let's talk a little bit about density. I mentioned this a few slides ago that bale density is really, really important. If we get our really soft and kind of not dense floppy bales, that's really going to give the opportunity for spoilage internally in that bale. So getting your bale as dense as possible is really going to give you the best opportunity for fermentation, the best opportunity for that high quality forage. And it's also going to give you a longer life of that whole bale without spoilage. So what I mean by that is after we are unwrapping that bale and exposing it to air, immediately there's going to start trying to have spoilage occur. But if we have a really dense bale with a really tight center and a really hard core, that oxygen is not going to be able to penetrate into that bale as quickly as if you have a really low dense or kind of soppy bale. And so that's going to allow, as you are setting that bale into a feed bunk or into a feed trough, that's really going to allow that bale to maintain its integrity and maintain its feed quality longer than with a lesser dense bale. This is some work that I did several years ago whenever I was still at Penn State. And what we did was we looked at different bale densities. So you can see that along the bottom. We had different densities, and then we unwrapped these bales and we calculated how long it took for those bales to spoil. And we did see a relationship that the longer or the greater the bale density, the longer it took for those bales to be considered spoiled. We had little thermometers on the internal portion of those bales. And once that inside of those bales reaches 2 degrees Fahrenheit above its baseline temperature at unwrapping, it is considered spoiled. So that's really how we quantified this. And as you can see, the greater the density of the bale, the longer it took for those bales to spoil. We also saw a reduction in overall pH as that bale density increased. And I also want to point out that this is across 4 different balers. So this is a bunch, all of these dots represent bales that came out of 4 different balers. So this is not baler specific. This just has to do with bale density as a whole. And so we saw that as that bale density increased, the overall bale pH also reduced. We want the bale pH to be as low as possible in these bales. What pH is going to do is going to be an indicator of how well those sugars were converted into acids. And it's also going to be an indicator of how stable that bale is going to be in that bunk after it's unwrapped, after it's exposed to oxygen. We also saw a decline in sugar content in this study, meaning the denser the bale, the better the conversion of sugars into acids and the more stable that bale was after it went through the fermentation phase. Here we see an inverse relationship of bale density to total acid production. So as that bale density increased, total acids also increased, which is a good thing. That goes hand in hand with this pH that we're seeing here. We want the acid production to be as great as possible. That's indicating proper fermentation. It's indicating bale stability. So this is, if we're talking about wrapping and talking about when to wrap and how to wrap, this is very, very important whenever we're talking about optimal baleage production. So this is a project that was done by Dr. Dan Undersander in Wisconsin many, many years ago. And they wanted to look at the effect of total wrap thickness, plastic wrap thickness on overall bale temperature. And just to give you a little bit of background, once that bale reaches over 120 degrees, the sugars are being bound up by the heating and some of the proteins are being denatured, and they're then going to be unavailable for animals, nutritionally speaking. So the goal in any baleage production or any silage production or hay production in general is going to be to keep that temperature as low as possible and definitely to keep it under the 120 degree mark. So you can see that with no wrap at all, he certainly got over that 120 degree mark. This is going to result in a significant decline in overall forage quality. And while just having 2 mils of thickness really didn't reach that 120 point, it certainly got much higher than the 3 mils or the 4 mils or the 6 mils in what this study is showing. And so even with the increase in temperature, we are going to get a decline in overall forage quality and also a decline in overall dry matter yield. As the temperatures increase, the dry matter yield is going to decline. So the microbes are going to be utilizing some of those really valuable nutrients for themselves and not for the crop quality. So what he derived from this study is that 6 mil thickness is really the sweet spot whenever we're talking about wrapping bales and needing it to be a certain thickness. So what that means is if you have a 1 mil thick plastic, you're going to want to wrap that at least 6 times. 8 times would even be better. If you have a 1.5 mil plastic, probably going to need to wrap that about 4 times. So it's really important to make sure that you're familiar with the type of plastic film that you're using, the thickness, as well as the tension on your wrapper or on your inline wrapper, so that you can make sure that you're getting that plastic as thick as what it needs to be. Also in that study, he took a look at timing of wrapping after baling. And what he derived was you really need to get that bale wrapped within 24 hours. He looked at 0 hours here. Take a look at how low that red line, take a look at how low that bale temperature was. I mean, that is beautiful right there. That is showing that by getting that bale wrapped immediately, we're really reducing that overall internal temperature and optimizing that forage quality. We're giving that bale a fighting chance to convert those sugars into acids while keeping that bale temperature low. However, he also recommended, based on this study, that we just wrap our bales within a 24-hour period. So that has really been kind of the gold standard across the industry, is making sure that we're getting our silage bales wrapped within a day after getting them made. At Massey Ferguson, we have a baler called the ProTech. And essentially what this baler does is it is wrapping the bales as soon as they exit the bale chamber. We have a table on the back of the baler, which you can kind of see here in this picture. I should have put a better picture on here, truthfully, for you all to see. But we have a table right on the back of the baler that as that baler is picking up the forage and it's going into the chamber for the next bale, the previous bale is being wrapped and it's being dropped right there in the field already wrapped. So we're getting that 0 hour treatment that we see in this predecessing study. We're getting that 0 hour treatment every single time we bale, and it's doing it right there all in one machine. So what we took a look at was the same type of trial that Dr. Undersander did, only instead of looking at it at 0 hours, 24 hours, 48, and 96 hours, we actually took a look at it in much smaller hour increments. We wanted to see how quickly does that bale heat up? How quickly does that forage quality really change after we're baling this high moisture forage? And so we did this project back in 2020, August of 2020 in Southeast Pennsylvania, Kennett Square, Pennsylvania. And we looked at this at 0 hours. So essentially wrapping that bale with the ProTech as it was intended, as soon as it's coming out of the bale chamber. We then waited 2 hours, 4 hours, 8 hours, and 24 hours after baling to go ahead and wrap that bale. So what we did was we hauled those bales to the storage location and went ahead and wrapped them there in those overall increments. And what we saw was, so WSC is water-soluble carbohydrates, as we talked about before, or sugars. And in these next couple of slides, the red line is going to be the day 0, or the day that it was wrapped. And the black line is going to be the 4 weeks later, day 28, whenever we went back and collected that second forage quality analysis. So what we saw was a rapid decline in water-soluble carbohydrates as that time went from 0 hours to 24 hours. So what this is showing is even at the 2 hour mark, those carbohydrates are starting to become consumed by something, even as quickly as 2 hours after that bale is exiting the chamber. Those carbohydrates are starting to be consumed by some sort of microbes, probably the aerobic microbes, and there's going to be some conversion already starting into acids. Now, not all acids are created equal whenever it comes to silage. What we want is to see an optimal lactic to acetic acid ratio. Lactic acid is going to have the greatest preservative effect. It should make up the majority of the total acid composition in a good silage. Acetic acid levels can also be good, but elevated acetic acid levels are going to be an indicator of a prolonged aerobic phase. So if that silage is not wrapped quickly, if it's not wrapped adequately, if it's not packed in a bunk quickly, etc. So what we want to see is a greater lactic to acetic acid ratio. We want to see higher lactic acid versus acetic acid. So at that day 0 mark, that red line, you can see that there was already some conversion of lactic acid and acetic acid right away. So what this is showing is this typical 24-hour recommendation that we're having. There's already things going on within that bale before that 24-hour mark. And if we're taking a look at the lactic to acetic acid ratio at the day 28 mark, or after fermentation, take a look at how high that ratio is going to be at the 0 hour. So this at the 0 hour had the best preservative effect. We had the best ratio of lactic to acetic acid, and it declined from at the 2 hour mark, declined to the 4 hour mark. We had a bump up at the 8 hour mark. It's a mystery why that happened. It could have just been an effect of our randomization. And then we again saw a decline at that 24-hour mark. So we're seeing a pretty significant drop in the overall desirable acids from waiting at that 0 hour all the way up to the 24-hour mark. Now, inversely, butyric acid is a very negative acid that we want to see. We want to see as low butyric acid concentration as possible. At the 0 hour mark, we saw no butyric acid accumulation whatsoever in any treatment. However, I want you to take a look at the 2, 4, and 8 hour percent butyric acid, and then what happened from 8 hours to 24 hours. I do want to make a disclaimer that it takes more of a percent of butyric acid than what was shown in this study for that feed to be considered spoiled and for it to be considered unfeedable. Butyric acid, just to give you an idea of what it is the smell of stinky feet. So the smell of stinky feet that you are smelling is actually butyric acid production. And so this really has a negative impact on palatability, even at this rate of a very small amount. The animals are going to smell this butyric acid, and it's going to reduce the overall palatability and desire for this feed to be eaten. And truthfully, whenever I went out there and cored those 24-hour bales at that 4-week mark, without even looking at the marking on the bale, I could tell which bales were baled at 24 hours or were wrapped at 24 hours based on the smell, just coming out of the forage corer as I was collecting those samples. So like I said, the numbers indicated here are still a viable feed. So they were not too spoiled to be able to not feed these. But we did see a huge spike in overall butyric acid production, which is going to lead to a reduced palatability from the 0 hour to the 24-hour mark after baling. Available crude protein, we saw a overall decline. If we're taking a look at that black line, we saw a decline in available crude protein by about 4%. So what this is going to show is about 4% of the protein that was available at baling is going to be reduced by waiting an entire day to wrap those bales versus wrapping them right out of the chamber. In this, we really saw no difference in the 0 hour to 2 hour mark. And as we go through, you're really going to see a cutoff at that 4 hour and 8 hour mark that's really going to be key to making sure that we're optimizing our overall nutrients. Again, here is that cutoff at the 8 hours for percent digestibility that I just mentioned. So if you take a look at the scale here, I have the scale blown up so that you can see more detailed differences in terms of percent digestibility. But if you're looking between 0, 2, 4, and 8, there really is not a huge amount of difference, less than 1% difference in overall digestibility between the 0 to 8 hour time frame. So what this is showing us is, even though we did see some significant differences for our overall acid accumulation, we did not see any differences for our percent digestibility between that 0, 2, 4, and 8 hour time period. So this is showing that you can still optimize percent digestibility as long as you are wrapping those bales within 8 hours. Where we did see a significant decline, anywhere from 2 to 3% in total digestibility, which can really change overall animal performance, is whenever we waited that full 24 hours. So if your goal is to get as high of quality as possible in your forage, if you're already at a race against time because maybe you are harvesting your forage a little bit later than what is ideal, as we talked about a few slides ago, you really want to make sure that you're wrapping that bale as quickly as possible after it comes out of the baler, so that you can optimize that overall digestibility as best as possible. And I do have a little bit of cowboy math on here, just talking about what that increase in digestibility can give you if we're talking about animal nutrition benefits on milk yield and also on overall cattle gains. It's significant. That 3% improvement that we're seeing is significant whenever we're talking about overall animal gains. Let's see, we already talked about available protein. That's just taking a look at it in a bar graph form. Now, we did replicate this project this past year in Beauvais, France, at one of our locations, one of our Massey Ferguson plants in France. One thing that they did, actually two things that they did different this year versus what we did back in 2020 was they included a 48-hour treatment. So very similar to what Dr. Dan Undersander did by looking at the 0-hour, 24-hour, and 48-hour. But another thing that they did that we are definitely going to correct this year is they did it at a different time of the year. So whenever I did it here in Pennsylvania, we did this in August. It was hot as blue blazes out, and we really saw some significant effects very quickly, probably because of the environmental temperatures. But in France, the end of April, temperatures are quite mild. And so we definitely saw differences in terms of responses to these different treatments. And probably a lot of that had to do with overall environmental responses. But there's a few things that I wanted to point out. Even though this was being conducted in Western Europe, we saw some very, very similar trends. We saw, once again, a cutoff here at this 4-hour time frame. So what this is showing us is optimize our percent digestibility, right, by getting that crop baled and wrapped at the 0, 2, or 4 hours after baling, rather than waiting 8, 24, or 48 hours. We also saw a change in ADF percent. So the ADF percent numbers here are extremely low. They do use a different way of analyzing acid detergent fiber than what we do. So please keep that in mind. I know that this looks like there's basically no ADF at all in this crop, but they just use a slightly different way of analyzing that there than here. But what I wanted to point out was, again, this difference in the 4-hour and then bumping up to the 8-hour, how we saw a change in our overall acid detergent fiber, which is going to lead to a change in overall digestibility of this crop. On the right side here, they saw changes in what they call a UFL, or a milk forage unit. So this is essentially going to be very similar to our NEL number. And so what they do is they use this to show how much milk a certain crop is going to produce. So without going into the details, all I wanted to show with this was, once again, they saw that sharp cutoff, that sharp decline in overall forage quality at that 8-hour time frame. So really what this is coming down to is optimizing our forage quality while making sure that our labor can be maintained. So the goal is going to be to get that bale wrapped as quickly as possible, as we just talked about. What these two studies have shown is that that 24-hour mark is really showing us a decline in overall forage quality. So really, we want to get that bale wrapped within 4 hours of baling, 8 hours at the absolute maximum. And so it's important to sit back and think about labor resources, think about efficiency on your farm, and how to best make sure that you are optimizing overall production so that you can get those bales off of the field and wrapped as quickly as possible. You know, it's really common for farmers to go ahead and try and mow as much as possible, rake as much as possible, bale as much as possible, and then move all of those bales to their storage location and then wrap all of them at the same time. But I challenge you to think more in terms of the results of this study. Think about baling smaller amounts of crop at one time and transferring those to the storage location and getting those wrapped as quickly as possible so that you can help to optimize your overall forage quality. I should have had this several slides ago. I apologize, this is out of order, but if we're thinking back to bale density, how can we tell if we have a dense bale? If you take a look at the bale here on the left, you can see it's kind of squatty. You can see some pockets of air there around the edges. You can see how it's just rounded off in nature. And if we have the bale on the right, you can see how it's going to have those really sharp edges, really not a lot of pockets of air at all. If there's any, it's right there along the flat edge of the bale. And that's really going to be excluded as that aerobic phase gets converted into anaerobic. So if you're trying to increase the overall density of your bales, this is something to think about. Look at the bales. Yes, you can weigh them, you can take their measurements, you can get an actual quantification of how dense your bale is, but you can really tell a lot just by looking at it and trying to sharpen those edges and make that bale maintain its shape as best as possible. So if we're taking a look at bale storage, there's a few things that we need to think about to make sure that we are keeping that bale stored as best as possible, because this is a huge part of making sure that we are maintaining the overall quality of the bales. So previous research has shown that dry hay stored outside can result in 20 to 30% dry matter loss in just 8 months. And truthfully, if you have harsh weather, it can be even greater than that. So with this silage, with this bale silage, the less need for actual storage facilities is going to occur. So these are going to have their own little storage cells, whether they are wrapped individually or whether they are having an inline wrapper. You don't need to store these under roof like you need to with your dry hay, or under a tarp like you need to with your dry hay, to help to conserve that overall dry matter loss. You can keep it stored outside. Also, you can set it up on its flat end, unlike dry hay. So depending on how you prefer to keep it stored, or how your feeding solution is going to be, we typically recommend to not store your dry hay on the flat end. We like it to be on the rounded, thatchy side so that it's going to help to reduce the overall dry matter losses. But you can store your silage any way you want. Also, ensiling warm season annuals can be a management strategy for a high nitrate grass. So some previous literature suggests that an average of 50% of those nitrate levels are going to be reduced by properly ensiled forages due to the denitrification process. So if you have some warm season annuals, or even some cool season annuals that are pushing that line in terms of being safe for animal consumption, proper fermentation process can help to denitrify those crops and can actually make them safe for animal consumption. However, there's a huge disclaimer here. Make sure that even after you have completely ensiled that crop and it has completely gone through the fermentation process, you need to make sure that you are still getting a forage quality report to make sure that those nitrate levels are safe for consumption for your livestock. We want to make sure that we're storing these on a flat, well-drained, smooth surface. We don't want stems or rocks poking through the film. We don't want rodent damage to occur. And if any of that occurs, we want to repair with a silage approved tape immediately. After you have these bales wrapped, you don't want to move or handle them after 12 hours. So you have a 12-hour window after they've been wrapped to get them to whatever location they need to remain at. After that point, squeezing them can break the film layers and potentially expose the bales to oxygen, which are going to restart the aerobic phase. If you think back, way back to the beginning, one of the very first slides that I showed was talking about the conversion of the aerobic phase into the anaerobic phase, which is going to be when the fermentation process starts to occur that we are shooting for. So after that 12-hour time frame, it's already starting to be converted into the anaerobic phase of fermentation. We absolutely do not want to introduce oxygen back to those bales again. So it's very important. If you run your rows north to south, this is going to help with the degradation from UV rays of the plastic based on how the sun rises and sets. We also want to wrap as close to the storage site as possible to reduce hauling, because hauling water is expensive. So some of the disadvantages that we're going to run across with these silage bales is going to be increased harvest cost per bale. Typically, you're going to need a special baler to handle heavy, wet bales. You're going to need some sort of plastic wrapper, whether that be a baler like our ProTech that's going to wrap it right there as it bales. If you have an individual bale wrapper, a standalone bale wrapper, a trail behind bale wrapper that you can actually pull with your tractor and wrap those bales in the field, or an inline bale wrapper. There's many different options, but regardless, all of those cost money. Also, your disposal of used plastic. This has been the greatest debate and the biggest conversation in my line of work is this used plastic. What can we do with it? What is an environmentally sound and environmentally safe solution? Also, damage to plastic from rodents, birds, bears, deer, other objects, it occurs. And it's really important that we're going out and making sure that we don't have huge holes in the plastic film. As soon as we see those holes, they need to be repaired with proper silage tape immediately. Duct tape is not going to work for this. If you hold duct tape up to the light, you can actually see light coming through it. That's going to mean that it's not excluding oxygen the way that it needs to. So make sure that you have proper silage tape to patch those holes that you are definitely going to get at some point. I heard of a couple of years ago, one guy had a bear problem with his silage, and apparently bears really like the smell and taste of silage. So it's just really important to make sure that you're keeping an eye on those bales and trying to reduce that infiltration of oxygen as much as possible. Transportation, we're hauling water. We're hauling a higher moisture forage. The higher the moisture, the more water we're hauling. So that, of course, is going to be a disadvantage. Please take note of my email address here. I'd be happy to reach out to you and talk to you more about any questions that you might have about any of our machines or forage production or livestock nutrition in general. That's my role within the AGCO company, is kind of a consultant role. So I consult with our engineers, our product managers, our marketing team, our dealers, our salesmen, and I make sure that what we are selling and what we are doing company-wide is agronomically and animal nutritionally sound. So please don't hesitate at all to reach out with any questions you might have. And if I don't know the answer, I can certainly get you in touch with someone that does.
All right, I'm not seeing any questions come through. So thank you again, Dr. Williamson, for your presentation. I'll let you go so you can make it to your other meeting on time. And we encourage people to follow up with her if you do have questions later on.
Absolutely. Thank you guys so much. It was a pleasure this morning.